No man will ever want what's left of you.
That was your final mistake. She's under my protection now.
7 years in my house, and you still couldn't make me want to stay. Look at you. What kind of future do you honestly think you have? For 7 years, Lena Holloway had been reducing herself by degrees so small she barely noticed any single one. By the time she understood what had happened, she had almost nothing left that was actually hers. 3 months after filing for divorce from Garrett Davenport, she walked back into the one room where their names had always appeared together, now carrying only her own. She had a gallery she was fighting to keep and one version of herself she refused to surrender. What she did not know was that Roman Volkov had been watching this situation for considerably longer than she had, and that the evening she was about to walk into was going to change every calculation on the board. There is something you should understand about Garrett Davenport. Before this story begins, he was not a cruel man in the obvious sense. He did not shout. He did not make threats in language you could point to later and say, "That is the thing." Right there. What he did was something more precise than cruelty, and in some ways, considerably more difficult to survive, because it left no visible mark and made it nearly impossible afterward to explain what had happened to you. He managed people. He managed them the way a certain kind of investor manages a portfolio, with patience and strategy and the absolute conviction that he was the most qualified person in any room to determine what everything and everyone inside it was worth. He had been managing Lena Holloway for 7 years. She was 34 years old, and she had a gallery on West 23rd Street that she had built herself. And she had a degree from Yale that she had earned before she ever met him, and she had a brain that was considerably sharper than most people in the rooms she had spent the past 7 years occupying had ever thought to find out. She had let herself be managed. That was the part she had the hardest time forgiving herself for, not what he had done, what she had allowed, the small agreements, the quiet deferring, the version of herself she had pruned back, season by season, until the shape she occupied in any given room was a fraction of what it had once been. But she was done with that version now. That was the thing he had not yet understood. 3 months after the divorce filing, she walked into the Harlow Foundation Gala, held every second Friday of October at the Park Avenue Intercontinental, without exception, for 11 consecutive years. She and Garrett had co-chaired it in years 4, 5, and 6. She had put in somewhere close to 400 hours over those 3 years and had received, as acknowledgement, her name listed second on the program. Tonight she walked in with her own name, her own ticket, and a dark green silk dress she had chosen herself, without asking anyone's opinion. No champagne tones, no blush. She had stopped dressing for his preferences 8 months before she filed the papers. She made it 90 minutes before he found her. She had spotted him twice across the room and adjusted accordingly. She had 2 conversations she wanted to have that evening. One with the director of a nonprofit she was considering for a gallery partnership, and one with an old contact from the arts funding world. She got both of them started before Garrett materialized at her left shoulder with the specific timing of a man who has been watching and waiting for the right opening. He said her name with the tone he used when he wanted something, and had decided warmth was the most efficient vehicle for getting it. She turned around. He still looked exactly the way he had always looked, which was one of the aggravating things about Garrett Davenport. The dark suit, no tie, the haircut that cost $200 to appear effortless, the smile held at exactly 60%, friendly enough to read as open, controlled enough to signal that the openness was entirely optional and could be withdrawn at his discretion. She had spent 7 years learning to read that smile. She did not miss any of it. He glanced at the people standing within earshot and made his assessment. Daniel Forsyth from 2 of his nonprofit boards, Patricia Riss, who ran a gallery 2 blocks from hers and had sent her a handwritten note 3 months ago that Lena had read twice and kept, Marcus Elliott, who had been at their wedding and reported everything he witnessed back to Garrett's circle. Usually before finishing his 3rd drink, Garrett had assessed all 3 also. She could tell by the way he settled into what came next. The gallery, he said. The smile had shifted into something that retained the architecture of pleasantness while abandoning any actual intention of it. 7 years in my house. Lena, 7 years, and you still could not make me want to stay. He tilted his head slightly. Look at you. What kind of future do you honestly think you have? He did not say it loudly. He did not need to. Patricia Reese went completely still. Marcus Elliott put his drink down. She held Garrett's gaze. She felt the words land on everyone in that small radius, and on herself. And she was composing the measured response when the room changed. She felt it before she saw it. The conversations around her did not stop. They fractured. A collective half-second loss of attention moving through the room like a current beneath water. 50 simultaneous redirects happening at once. The kind of thing that only happens when something enters a space that requires everyone, without being told, to reorganize around it. She turned. Here is what you need to know about Roman Volkov, and you need to know it now because it matters to everything that follows. He was not famous in the conventional sense. His name did not appear in celebrity coverage. He did not give interviews. He had not, to anyone's knowledge, attended a party voluntarily in 4 years. What he was known in the way that certain people are known in certain worlds, not because of what they say about themselves, but because of what other people do not say about them, which is more revealing. People did not discuss Roman Volkov casually or loudly. They discussed him carefully in the financial world and in certain other worlds that ran alongside it in parallel. His name moved through rooms the way weather moves through a forecast, quietly, with weight, and with the understanding that paying attention was probably a good idea. He was perhaps 6'1" in his dress shoes, dark suit, no tie, no watch visible. He had the kind of face that read differently depending on which angle you caught it from. Straight on, it was composed to the point of being sealed. In profile, something underneath that control surfaced. The face of a man who had made a very large number of decisions and had stopped finding the making of them particularly difficult. His security detail was invisible in the way that excellent security is invisible. She did not see them directly. She registered them by what happened to the room as he moved through it, a quiet clearing, not dramatic. People simply found themselves a foot or two further from his path than they had been a moment before, without any of them being able to say afterward that anyone had asked them to move. Garrett turned to look. She watched him run the automatic calculation he ran in every room: assess, categorize, determine relevance. She saw the moment he landed on a name. The calculation took longer than it should have. Roman did not survey the room the way most men with his resources surveyed a room. He walked in already knowing where he was going. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never once in his adult life had to wonder whether he would be allowed to go where he intended. He was looking at her the entire time. It took her 3 full seconds to understand this. He stopped in front of her, not beside her, in front of her, which meant he was also in front of Garrett, and Garrett would have to physically move around him to continue what had been happening. He looked at her with a quality of attention she was not immediately able to name. Something careful in a way the rest of his bearing was not. He said his name. He held out his hand. She shook it. Then he turned to face Garrett directly. not aggressively, not with the energy of a confrontation, with the specific ease of a man who has never once needed to perform confidence because he has never experienced its absence. He looked at Garrett Davenport. The way you look at a piece of furniture you have noticed is in a slightly inconvenient location. She is with me tonight, he said. 5 words. Quiet. Delivered with no inflection that could be called threatening and no content that could be called aggressive. Simply a statement of fact from a man for whom statements of fact were the only register he had ever found necessary. He did not wait for a response. He simply turned back to Lena as if the matter had been concluded, which it had. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Garrett did not respond. This was the most significant thing that happened all evening, and anyone paying attention understood it immediately. Garrett Davenport, who had not once in 11 years failed to find the angle in any interaction, did not respond. He opened his mouth once and closed it, and then he looked at the space to Roman's left and said nothing at all. Patricia Riss made a sound that was not quite a word. Roman offered Lena his arm. She took it. She did not look back at Garrett. She looked forward at the room, which was reorganizing itself around the new information the way rooms always do, quietly and thoroughly, and with the collective efficiency of people who understand social architecture instinctively, even when they cannot name its rules. She was aware of being irritated with herself for the way her pulse had elevated, which was more than was warranted. She reminded herself that she did not know this man. She reminded herself that she had spent 7 years inside arrangements that looked like one thing and another, and that she was required to be cautious. She also could not avoid noting that what had just happened was the first time in 7 years that anyone had stood between her and Garrett Davenport and said something that cost them nothing to say to her and everything to say to him. She filed that and kept moving. The rest of the evening was everything she had wanted. She had the conversation with the nonprofit director. She had the conversation with the arts funding contact. She ate dinner at a table where no one required anything from her except her actual opinions, which people seemed to find refreshingly interesting. Roman did not attach himself to her side. He circulated with the efficiency of someone who had a specific purpose and no interest in what did not serve it. But he was present in the room in a way that meant Garrett remained on the far side of it all evening, because Garrett did not choose to occupy the same quadrant as Roman Volkov, and she suspected this was not accidental on anyone's part. Near the end of the evening, as the auction wound down and the room began its slow dissolution, he found her near the coat check. He produced a card from his jacket, no logo, no title, his name and a phone number in clean type. "For when you decide what to make of tonight," he said. "There is no timeline." She took it. The elevator. They ended up in the same one. She made the decision not to spend energy calculating whether this was coincidence. The doors closed. He was quiet for a moment. She watched the numbers descend. Then, "I know what you did for Katya." She turned. He was looking at the closed doors. The line of his jaw said this had cost him something to say out loud. Roman Volkov, in 3 hours of her observing him, did not appear to be a man who found many things costly. She noted that this one was. 5 years ago, he said, the gallery on Mercer Street. She was 19. She sat on the floor of your back room and she needed help, and you stayed with her for 2 hours, and you called an ambulance, and you did not call anyone else, not the press, not the police. When I arrived and she was stable, you had left instructions with your staff that you hoped she was well and that the matter was private. She remembered the girl, the coat that cost more than her monthly rent, the way something essential had simply gone out of her all at once. Lena had done what seemed like the obvious thing. She had sat down next to her. She had stayed until the paramedics came and until the girl was coherent enough to give a name to call. She had not known who the girl was. She had done what you did when someone needed you to stay. She has been well, he said. She is well. I wanted you to know that. The lobby opened around them. She stepped out. I am glad, she said, and she meant it entirely and without complication. She got her coat. She went home. She sat in the back of a car going downtown and held the card in her hand and turned it over once. She thought about a man crossing a ballroom floor and saying 5 words to her husband and then turning away from her husband as if he had already ceased to be the relevant party. She did not throw the card away. She did not call for 4 days. This was not uncertainty. It was something she had learned to practice deliberately over the past year. The habit of sitting with a decision long enough to be sure she was responding to reality and not to her own adrenaline. She had spent 7 years inside a marriage where her instincts had been systematically overridden until she stopped trusting them, and rebuilding that trust was slower work than she had anticipated and more necessary than she could have explained to anyone who had not lost it the same way. She worked. She had a photographer coming from New Mexico whose show opened in 6 weeks, and the east wall needed a complete rehang, and the logistics of that alone would have filled her days even without the amended motions. Garrett's attorneys were generating with the relentless productivity of people being paid by the hour to make her life expensive. The email from her attorney came on the 5th morning, an amended motion challenging the gallery's valuation, citing 3 separate appraisers, all of them from firms with documented relationships to Davenport Capital in the past 4 years. Her attorney noted this in language that was legally precise and emotionally dry. Lena translated it without effort. Garrett was going to bury her in paper until she ran out of money, or will, or both. This was what the Davenport family had always done with problems that resisted other approaches. Apply enough procedural weight and wait. She picked up her phone and called the number on the card. 2 rings. Ms. Holloway, he said. Not a question. How did you know it was me? She said. I gave that number to one person, he said. She took this in. I would like to meet somewhere that is not a party. The gallery, he said. Her space, her terms. 2 o'clock today, if that works. It works, he said. He arrived at 1:55. He was not alone. The young woman who came through the door behind him was in her mid-20s, dark-haired, a coat that was expensive without announcing it. She had Roman's eyes in a way that was immediately recognizable once you were looking. The same quality and depth, but where his were sealed, hers were open. The kind of open that comes from having learned at some point what happened when you kept things locked up too long. Lena recognized her the way you recognize someone you last saw in a difficult moment. The face had filled out. The posture was entirely different, but the eyes. The young woman stopped just inside the door. I asked her not to come, Roman said flatly. You said you were meeting someone at a gallery, the young woman said to him, without looking at him. You did not say which one. I figured it out. You figured it out, he repeated, in the tone of someone who has had this exact dynamic play out enough times that surprise is no longer on the menu. The young woman looked at Lena and dropped the performance of composure she had been maintaining. It went quickly and completely, the way composure goes when something matters more than the effort of holding it. I looked for you, she said, a few months after. I went back to the gallery on Mercer, and they said you were gone. I tried for 3 years, off and on. Your name was not connected to anything public for a while, and then I found the gallery on 23rd, and I was not sure it was you, and then I was. She stopped. I thought you should know that. She had moved. The gallery on Mercer had closed 18 months after that. and she had spent a period working for someone else before opening here. It had simply not occurred to her that she was hard to find because she had not imagined anyone was looking. Katya, Roman said. One word, a specific frequency, not a warning. The sound of someone who loves a person and has learned, slowly, that loving them does not mean controlling how they move through the world. I just needed to say it, Katya said, to your actual face. Thank you. Lena thought about what to do with someone saying something they had been carrying for 3 years and asking nothing further in return. She did not come up with anything more complicated than the truth. I am glad you are here, she said, both of those ways. Katya nodded. Something in her face settled. She stayed 20 minutes, asked 2 genuine questions about the photographs on the wall, shook Lena's hand at the door, kissed Roman on the cheek, and walked out on to West 23rd with the particular energy of someone who has put something heavy down and is still figuring out what to do with their hands. Roman watched her through the gallery window without saying anything. She tracked this address herself, he said finally. She has been following your name in the arts press for 2 years, since she worked out that you were not at Mercer anymore. He turned back to a photograph on the east wall, a plateau at dusk, early work from the New Mexico series. I thought you should know. There was something in the way he said it, not performing generosity, just offering information he thought she deserved to have. Tell me about the partnership, she said. He told her. The structure. Volkov Industries needed cultural credibility that was genuine rather than transactional, and most of the galleries in his orbit had been chosen by committee and showed work chosen by committee and were, as a result, decorative in the way things chosen by committee always end up being. He had spent 18 months assessing alternatives. The Holloway Gallery had a curatorial point of view that was real and consistent and not for sale. In exchange for a formal partnership, he would provide operating support and access to a collector network the gallery currently could not reach. This would, as a practical side effect, resolve her balance sheet situation and make Garrett's valuation argument considerably harder to sustain in any court. He finished. 2 things, she said. He waited. The support has to be a direct grant, not a loan and not an equity position. I just spent 3 months getting free of an arrangement where someone held a financial claim on this space. I am not rebuilding that structure with a different name on it. He considered this. Grant structure works. What is the second? Curatorial independence. Complete. Your name on the partnership does not mean your board has opinions about my programming. I make the decisions. That is not a starting point. He was quiet for a moment. The board will want right of first refusal on major acquisitions going to public auction. The board can want that, she said. The answer is no. The reason you spent 18 months looking at this gallery is the curatorial independence. You cannot have it and also oversee it. Pick one. He looked at her steadily. She held the look, because she had learned over years of working with artists that looking away from silence was not composure. It was a different kind of yielding. Grant structure, he said, and full curatorial independence, both accepted. She had not expected him to agree that quickly. She did not show this. He produced a draft document from his jacket pocket, 3 pages. Have your attorney review it. 10 business days to revise. She took it. You brought the draft. I assumed you would negotiate. I did not know on which points. She looked at him for a moment. Most of the people I have dealt with recently do not respond well to being pushed back on. Most of the people you have dealt with recently needed you to believe they had more leverage than they did, he said, not as a criticism, as a plain description of what she had been living inside. That is not what this is. 2 days after the partnership agreement was countersigned, a man walked into the gallery. He introduced himself as being from a commercial real estate investment group and said he had questions about the gallery's long-term lease structure and its operating reserves. He was in his 40s, well-dressed, and had the particular manner of someone who has been sent by someone else to accomplish something specific. The questions were pointed in a way that felt designed rather than curious. He mentioned twice, in passing, that he was familiar with the Davenport family and their philanthropic work in the arts. Lena answered his questions with the neutral attention of someone who has sat across from many rooms configured against her and learned to wait for the configuration to show itself completely before responding to any part of it. Then she said, without particular emphasis, that the gallery had recently finalized a formal operating partnership with Volkov Industries, and that questions about the property structure and financial reserves would be best directed to their legal team going forward. She could provide the contact information if that would be helpful. The man's expression did not change, but his posture did. Something settled in his shoulders that had not been settled before, a very small, very complete collapse of the readiness he had been maintaining since he walked through the door. He said he would be in touch with his principals and thanked her for her time. He went out onto 23rd Street. He was not in touch. Lena stood in the gallery for a moment after he left. She had understood, in an abstract way, what it meant to have aligned herself with Roman Volkov's name. She understood it considerably less abstractly now. A man had come in carrying the weight of someone who had sent him, and she had said one name once, without ceremony, as a piece of practical information, and the weight had simply lifted, just like that. She was not naive about what kind of world produced that result. She was also standing in her gallery, which was still hers, and which was going to stay that way. She filed the information and went back to work. That evening, her phone rang. Her sister, Becca Holloway, was 3 years younger and had always been the one in their family that people worried about, not because she was careless. The opposite. She cared so thoroughly about everything that when something went wrong, she had no mechanism for not taking the full weight of it personally. She was at Columbia finishing her doctorate in environmental science, genuinely brilliant at it, and carrying more debt than she had ever told Lena directly, because she had never wanted to be a weight on anyone. And Becca's definition of not being a weight included not mentioning when she was drowning. "Hey," Becca said when Lena picked up. "Hey, everything okay?" "Probably." The pause was slightly too long. "I got a weird call today. Someone who said they were from a law firm, but would not give a name. They were asking about my student loan situation, what servicer I use, what the outstanding balance is, my payment history." Lena sat down. She kept her voice level. The performance of someone receiving mildly interesting information rather than someone who has just understood exactly what is happening. "Did you give them anything?" I said, "I do not give financial information to people who call without proper identification," and hung up. "But that is strange." "Right. Yeah," Lena said. "If they call back, do not answer. Just take a name and number and call me. Is this about the divorce?" "I do not know yet," which was true in the narrow sense that she could not yet prove it, and untrue in every other. "Lena, I am handling it," she said. They talked for 15 minutes about Becca's research and the department's broken coffee machine and the note someone had taped to it that said in memoriam. Lena laughed at this. After she hung up, she sat in her kitchen with the understanding, clear and cold, that Garrett was mapping her sister. He had found the soft thing in her life, and he was already measuring it. The following morning she called Roman. "One ring, Lena," he said. He had registered the shift without being told. "He is looking at my sister," she said. A brief silence. "Tell me," he said. She did. The call from Garrett's assistant came on a Wednesday morning, not his attorney's, his assistant, the same woman who had managed their social calendar for 8 years, now asking if Lena was available Thursday at 10 to meet directly about the mediation timeline. Her attorney said no. He said it clearly and professionally, and with 22 years of watching people walk into rooms they should not have walked into behind every word, she went anyway. Here is what you need to understand about Garrett Davenport when he is losing. He does not become reckless. He does not lose his temper or say things in anger that he cannot take back later. What he does is become more precise. He identifies the specific load-bearing wall in someone's life, and he applies exactly the right amount of pressure to exactly the right place. The precision is, in its own way, the frightening part. It means he has done his homework. It means whatever he is about to say, he has thought about for longer than you have had to prepare for it. When his assistant called to schedule that meeting, Garrett Davenport already knew exactly what he intended to say when Lena walked through the door. The offices of Davenport Capital occupied 4 floors of a building on Park Avenue designed to communicate one thing. The people inside it had more patience than you did. Everything was the same deliberate gray, chosen to make visitors feel that the walls themselves were not especially impressed with them. The conference room on the 31st floor had floor-to-ceiling windows facing north and a view almost to the bridge on a clear day. His family's estate attorney was already seated when Lena came in. Garrett stood, pulled out her chair, offered coffee or water. All of it performed with the fluency of a man who has been using hospitality as a dominant strategy since before she met him. She said water, sat down, and did not take out a notepad because she was there to listen, and she wanted every part of her body language to communicate exactly that. He opened with the mediation timeline. He wanted to accelerate it. He framed this as mutual benefit and used the phrase, both of our interests, twice in 4 sentences. She said she would pass the suggestion to her attorney. Then he put his hands flat on the table and moved to the thing he had actually scheduled the meeting to say. I have become aware that your sister is carrying significant student debt, he said, graduate loans, some personal borrowing from her undergraduate years. She is also approximately 3 months behind on her rent. I understand she has not told you the full extent of it because she does not want you worrying about her while you are managing the divorce. She went very still. She kept her face where she needed it. Here is what I am considering, he said. He looked genuinely regretful, which was the most insulting part, because the regret was as manufactured as everything else in this room. Becca is in a competitive doctoral program at Columbia. Those departments take academic integrity extremely seriously. I have become aware of some ambiguity in how she described a summer research internship on her doctoral application. The dates of her participation do not align cleanly with what the host institution has on record. She understood the full shape of it now. If a question like that were raised formally with the department chair, he said, there would be an internal review process. During that process, her research funding, her teaching stipend, and her access to the lab would typically be suspended until the matter was resolved. Several months, realistically. And in the meantime, someone would reach out to the company she listed as her employer during that period, asking questions she would need to answer personally and on the record. That internship is documented, she said. There is no ambiguity. Documentation can be interpreted in different ways. When someone with standing raises a formal question, he sat back slightly, the posture of a man who has delivered terms he prepared well in advance and is waiting for the other party to catch up to the math. I am not interested in doing any of this to Becca. She has nothing to do with us. I would much rather find a way to resolve the gallery valuation cleanly between us. without attorneys. In the next 10 days, she looked at him across the table. She looked at him the way you look at something you have studied long enough that no new surprises remain. I will be in touch, she said. She stood. She thanked the estate attorney for her time. She thanked Garrett for the water. She rode the elevator down 31 floors without looking at her own reflection and walked out of the building onto Park Avenue and stood on the sidewalk in the October cold for 40 seconds. Then she got in a cab and gave Roman's address on 57th Street. He met her in the elevator lobby on the 28th floor, shirt sleeves. First time she had seen him without a jacket. He looked at her face for 2 seconds and said nothing. He led her to his office, closed the door, stood a few feet away, and waited. She told him everything. All of it, precisely. She kept her voice level through most of it, and her voice stayed level all the way through. But her hands, which she had been holding still at her sides, moved when she got to the part about the department chair and the suspended stipend. She noticed this, and it irritated her. He was quiet through all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not begin composing a solution before she was finished. He simply received what she was saying as if it was worth receiving in full. When she stopped, he said, "What do you need right now? A solution or someone to be angry at first?" She looked at him. No one had ever asked her that. Not in 7 years of marriage. Not in 3 months of attorneys and legal filings and strategic conversations about next steps. Not in her entire adult life had anyone asked that question in that specific order, giving her the anger first as something legitimate in itself, rather than as an obstacle to clear before getting to the practical part. Both, she said, in that order. He nodded. He turned toward the window and back and let her talk. She talked, not loudly, because she had never been loud about the things that actually mattered, but directly and without the careful professional diplomacy she used in every other setting, because what she was describing did not deserve diplomatic language. She said what she thought about a man who spent 2 weeks mapping a 29-year-old doctoral student's finances for use as leverage in a divorce proceeding. She said what she thought about the specific kind of power that identifies the most vulnerable thing in someone's life and presses on it, without apology and without any apparent recognition that there is something wrong with doing that. She said it plainly and completely. He received all of it. When she finished, he said, "The loan situation can be handled. I have a foundation that processes education grants anonymously. We removed the pressure point before he can move on it. We do not know yet that he will actually move on it. He spent 2 weeks mapping it," Roman said. "A man who maps something for 2 weeks intends to use it. He always does." She knew this. She had known it in the cab. She had been trying not to think it directly, because thinking it directly meant confronting what it implied about how long this had been in preparation. "All right," she said. "Let us talk about the rest of it." They worked through the shape of a plan for an hour, and she was beginning to feel like they had something with real structure when her phone rang. Dana Reyes, 11 years, financial reporter. A code between them that meant she always called before she wrote the thing that was about to affect your life. She picked up. "I am calling as your friend first," Dana said. "Roman Volkov has been acquiring Davenport Capital debt instruments since last September, quietly, through 3 different vehicles. Nothing traceable to him directly until you are 4 layers in, but I am 4 layers in. He holds controlling positions in 2 of Garrett's primary credit facilities. He can call those instruments. If he does, Garrett needs to refinance on 60 days' notice or face a significant liquidity event." Lena went very still. She was aware of Roman on the other side of the room. She did not look at him. "How long have you known?" she said to Dana. "I confirmed this morning." "Thank you," she said. "I will call you back." She put the phone in her pocket. She stood in the middle of his office and looked at the city through the glass for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at him. Since September, she said. He did not perform surprise. He met her eyes directly. September, he said. October was when the first position cleared. She let the full shape of it assemble around her, not piece by piece, all at once. The way a picture resolves when you finally understand what you are actually looking at. A year. He had been building this for an entire year, before the gala, before the elevator, before he had said her name to her for the first time. You built a financial siege around my husband's company, she said, before we ever met. Yes, you walked into that gala knowing he could not respond, because he did not yet know what was already surrounding him. Yes, she crossed her arms. She looked at him with the specific clarity of someone who has not yet decided whether what they are feeling is fury or something more complicated. But who knows that either way the response is the same. 7 years, she said. I spent 7 years inside a marriage where every significant decision had already been made before anyone consulted me, where I was walked into rooms that had been configured in advance and presented with arrangements that were complete, and I was expected to receive them graciously. I got out of that. I swore I was done being inside someone else's plan without being asked. And you built one around me for a year and then introduced yourself. He held her gaze. He did not look away. He did not reach for an explanation or a defense. I know what that sounds like, he said. Tell me why it is different. He was quiet, not composing, actually sitting with the question. It is not different, he said. I did not ask you because I thought you could not refuse the outcome if you knew what it was in advance. I told myself that was logic. I understand now that it was exactly the same thing that was done to you, which is deciding someone's response before they have had the chance to make it. He paused. I was wrong. Here is the thing about Roman Volkov that Lena had not yet had enough time to fully understand. When he said he was wrong, he meant it, not as strategy, not as the specific calculated contrition of a powerful man managing someone's emotional reaction so he could back to what he actually wanted to discuss. He meant it the way people mean things when they have actually sat with what they said long enough to feel the weight of it landing. She had been in very few rooms in her adult life with men who did that. She did not yet know what to do with it. She picked up her bag. He did not move toward her. He did not ask her to stay. He let her leave. She walked 4 blocks before she slowed down. The city moved around her in its indifferent way, and she let it, because the city did not require anything from her. And right now, that was exactly what she needed. The following morning, she found an envelope on the gallery floor inside the mail slot, her name on the front in small, precise handwriting. She opened it standing at the door, a key and a folded piece of paper. These are yours. Every document my team has gathered. Safety deposit box at First Federal on 23rd. You owe me nothing for them. Whether you use them with me or alone is your decision. It always was. She stood in the empty gallery with the key in her hand. Then she set it on the counter and went to the back room and sat at the small desk with the locked drawer. She unlocked it. Inside, a manila folder. 4 months of her own work, built since June, begun because one depreciation figure in a quarterly summary was wrong by 2 zeros, and she could not leave a wrong number alone. She put her hand flat on the folder. Then she picked up her phone and called Becca. Becca answered on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless from the lab. Hey, everything okay? Everything is fine, Lena said. I just wanted to hear your voice. A small pause. Then warmth coming through the line. You never just call to hear my voice. Maybe I am starting to. Becca laughed. The real version. Unchanged since they were children. The coffee machine, she said. Someone added a votive candle under the in memoriam sign. It has been there 4 days, and no one will take it down because it is too accurate. That is a good candle, Lena said. It really is, Becca said. They talked for 12 minutes about nothing that mattered strategically and everything that mattered actually. After she hung up, Lena sat with her hand still on the folder and let herself feel, for one moment, the full weight of what she had been carrying for 4 months and what it was going to mean to stop carrying it alone. Then she opened the folder and went back to work. She gave herself one night, not to waver, not to reconsider, to be sure, in the specific way she had learned to be sure about things, sitting with the decision long enough to know the difference between choosing something and being pushed into it. By midnight, she had been through every page of the folder one more time, not looking for something she had missed, but confirming that she knew exactly what she was walking in with. She knew. She was at Roman's building at 8:45 the following morning. His office door was open. He stood when she came in. He looked at her face and did not speak first, which she had come to understand was a choice he made deliberately and not a reflex. She walked to the desk. She set the folder in front of him. "I have been building this since January," she said. "I did not need your key." He looked at the folder, then at her, then back at the folder. "Open it," she said. He sat down and opened it. He read the way she had learned. He read everything, carefully, without hurrying, going back twice on the second document, not because he missed something, but because he was confirming what he found. He did not make sounds. He did not express surprise. He went through every page with the focused attention of someone who understands that the cost of missing a detail is always higher than the cost of taking the time to find it. When he reached the last page, he closed the folder and put his hand flat on it and was quiet. Here is what Roman Volkov was actually looking at. Sitting in his office with his hand on a folder built by a woman he had walked into a charity gala to protect. He was looking at 4 months of solo intelligence work conducted under a different name, on almost no budget, while that same woman was simultaneously managing a gallery and fighting a divorce proceeding and maintaining a surface so unruffled that no one in Garrett Davenport's circle had registered that anything was happening underneath it. Roman had spent a year building what he believed was the decisive campaign. She had spent 4 months building what was actually going to be decisive. He had the hammer. She had built the nail, the board, and the wall. He was the last person in this equation to understand this, and he understood it now completely. And he sat with that understanding, without trying to manage it into something more comfortable. "I did not know you were doing this," he said. "I know," she said. That was the point. He looked up at her. Something had shifted in his face, not the composed surface. Underneath it, the specific look of a man who has just been required to significantly update his understanding he believed he had mapped. 4 months, he said, quietly. "Since the first week of June," she said. She sat down across from him. There was a depreciation figure on a subsidiary asset with 2 extra zeros that almost read as a data entry error and was not. Once I found the first one, I knew there would be more. I had 3 years of financial summaries in my records from the marriage. I spent 6 weeks going through all of them." He opened the folder again to the first document. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "She did this herself," he said. "What?" she said. He looked up. "That is what Garrett said, in the conference room. When I served him with the credit call documentation and his attorney's phone rang at the same moment with your court filing." He looked at both documents and he said, "She did this herself." He paused. "I thought you should hear it in his exact words." She looked at him. "You already moved." "I moved on Thursday," he said, "because the window was right and because waiting was creating exposure. I should have told you before I did." He held her gaze steadily. "I know that." She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, Tell me what happened in that room, he told her. But she needed to hear it from the beginning, and here is what actually happened in that room on the 24th floor of Volkov Industries that Tuesday afternoon. Garrett walked in at 2:28, 2 minutes early. He surveyed the room the way he surveyed every room, methodically, efficiently, reading the power structure before saying a word. Roman was at the head of the table. Two people Garrett did not immediately place on his right. A stack of documents face down at each seat. Garrett introduced himself. Roman introduced no one. He said, "Please sit down." Garrett sat. His restructuring attorney, a man named Fitch, who had not looked rattled in a client meeting in 20 years of practice, opened his legal pad. Garrett's CFO arranged his materials with the competence of someone who had managed 3 previous liquidity situations and expected to manage this one the same way. The fourth man at the table, a 60-something advisor from Garrett's father's financial circle, settled into his chair with the specific calm of someone for whom corporate restructuring was simply the cost of doing certain kinds of business. Roman picked up the document in front of him and slid it across the table without ceremony. Garrett looked at it. A formal notice. 3 pages, dense with specifics, bearing the letterhead of a Liechtenstein-registered entity. His eyes moved across the entity name once and then went back to it because it was not familiar. And unfamiliar names in formal legal notices required you to look again. The notice stated that the entity held controlling positions in 2 of Davenport Capital's primary credit facilities, totaling $240 million in outstanding instrument value, and was formally calling both. Davenport Capital had 60 days to cure in full or enter restructuring. Garrett's CFO picked up the document. He read the first page. Then he picked up his phone and started doing calculations. Then Fitch's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His own firm's number, he answered, listened for 12 seconds, and put the phone back on the table. He turned to Garrett. His voice was very careful. "We have received notification of a court filing in your divorce proceeding, filed this afternoon. The documentation is described as extensive," a pause that carried weight. "The filing alleges concealment of marital assets across 6 separate transactions. They have the bank records and a forensic accounting analysis." The CFO stopped doing calculations on his phone. The man from Garrett's father's circle, the one who had been in rooms like this for 40 years, looked at the surface of the table in front of him and did not look up. Garrett looked at the credit call notice. Then he looked at the court filing notification on Fitch's phone. Then he looked at the window. Roman did not speak. He waited. He was very good at waiting. Garrett picked up the court filing notification. He read the summary paragraph. He read it again. He set it down. "She did this herself," he said. "Not to Roman, not to Fitch, not to anyone in the room." He said it to the middle distance, in the tone of a man saying something out loud that he has just understood for the first time and does not yet know what to do with. The tone of someone who has been playing a game he believed he understood completely and has just discovered that the other player was running a different game the entire time. Fitch said, "Garrett, we need to step outside." Garrett did not move. He was looking at the 2 documents, the credit call notice and the court filing summary. He was looking at them the way you look at something when you finally understand that you have been competing against the wrong person, operating on the wrong information, and that the woman you had decided was not a serious opponent had been, in fact, more serious than anyone else in the equation for considerably longer than you had known. "She built this herself," he said again, still quiet, still to the middle distance. Then Fitch said his name in the specific tone lawyers use when a client is about to do something that will cost them later, and Garrett stood up. He thanked Roman for the meeting in a voice that had lost most of its previous texture. He said his team would follow up within 36 hours. Fitch accepted this on his behalf without being asked, which told Roman everything he needed to know about where Fitch thought this was going. At the door, Garrett stopped. He turned back, not to Roman specifically, to the table, to the two documents still lying there. He stood for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me one thing, the filing, the asset documentation. How long has she had it?" Roman said, "Since January." Garrett looked at the documents one more time. His face, in that moment, was doing something it had probably not done in public in a very long time. It was simply showing what was actually on it, with nothing managing the surface. Then he turned and walked out. Roman called Lena at 3:45. She was at the gallery, hanging the fourth photograph in the New Mexico series, Felix handing her things without being asked. She stepped to the back room. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She stood with the phone and listened and did not say anything until he was done. She had already seen the shape of it in her mind, had imagined this moment in various forms over 4 months of building toward it. But imagining and hearing are different experiences, and the distance between them is where everything real lives. He said it twice. Roman said, "She did this herself." The second time he said she built this herself. He was not speaking to anyone in particular. She stood in the back room of her gallery and looked at the east wall through the open doorway, the photographs taking their shape, the plateau at dusk in the October light coming through the front windows. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me," he said. "You built the mechanism. I delivered it." That evening, a text came in from Dana, just a link and no message. She clicked it. The article had been posted 40 minutes earlier. The implication, constructed with the specific craft of a piece shaped to suggest, rather than state, was that Lena Holloway had been involved with Roman Volkov for several years before the divorce filing, and that the financial pressure on Davenport Capital needed to be understood in this context. Photographs from public events. 2 unnamed sources. Nothing explicit. Everything arranged. She put the phone face down on the kitchen table. She sat for 2 minutes. She thought about what this would do if it circulated uncorrected for 48 hours. She thought about what it meant that Garrett had done it after the boardroom meeting, knowing exactly how it would read, doing it anyway, which meant he had understood exactly how bad his position was and had nothing better than this left. She picked up the phone and called Roman. First ring. "I saw it," he said. "He did it after the meeting," she said. "He understood what had just happened and did it anyway. It means he has nothing better." Roman said, "This is what a man looks like when he is out of place." She thought about that. "What do we do?" she said. "We correct it," he said, specifically and on the record. "Tomorrow morning." A pause. "I need to ask you something first. The statement will need to describe what the partnership actually is, the gallery, the formal agreement, the timeline, all of it visible. I want to make sure you want that before I put your name in anything." She thought about it for a real moment. "Yes," she said. "Issue it. I will send you the draft tonight." A brief quiet on the line. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. She went to bed and slept better than she had in months. Roman's statement went out on a Tuesday morning. 1 paragraph, specific and factual, with the confidence of a person who does not over-explain because they are not worried about being believed. It named the gallery and the date the partnership was signed. It described 18 months of professional connection through arts philanthropy. It said the previous evening's article contained material inaccuracies about both the nature and the timeline of his relationship with Lena Holloway. Here is how certain stories end in that world, not with a retraction, not with an apology, with a quiet revision in the night that most people never notice. different words in the same place, and the understanding on both sides that the thing is finished and will not be mentioned again by the following evening. 2 of the 3 outlets that had run the story had done exactly that. 4 days later, Caroline called. Garrett's lead attorney withdrew from the case this morning, she said. Lena was in the back room doing inventory. She stopped moving entirely. When a billing attorney at his rate walks away at this stage, Caroline said, it means he assessed what his client was prepared to do and made a professional judgment that his own reputation cost more than the fee. He took 2 associates with him. The settlement was reached 5 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon in Caroline's conference room. No final confrontation, no dramatic last exchange. Just the specific, exhausted resolution of people who have run out of defensible positions and the good sense to recognize it. The gallery was hers, uncontested. The 6 documented asset transfers were subject to equitable division. She signed. She shook Caroline's hand. She went back to work. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more durable than that. The specific lightness of something that has been over for a long time finally becoming officially over. Like removing a piece of furniture that had not belonged in a room for years and standing in the space where it used to be. You were right to move it, but now it was gone on the record, and the record made a different kind of room. The New Mexico show opened to 3 times the gallery's usual first weekend attendance. 2 collectors she had not previously been able to reach bought major pieces in the first 10 days. A museum curator from Chicago came on the second weekend, stayed 2 hours, and left her card. This was what she had been building toward, not just the settlement, not just the survival of the gallery. This, the thing where the work went somewhere it could be seen at the scale it deserved, by people who were ready to receive it. It was the second Friday of October, almost exactly a year. From the night she had walked into the Harlow Foundation gala alone and come out with a card in her coat pocket, and a question she did not yet have language for. She had a dress on the back of her office door, dark blue, Bleecker Street, found 3 weeks ago without looking for it. She had paid for it herself and had not asked anyone's opinion about it. Both facts still pleased her in a way that would have been difficult to explain to anyone who had not spent 7 years asking permission for things that were already hers. She put it on at 6:15. Roman picked her up at 7. He looked at her when she got in the car, and his face did the thing she had learned to read as his version of saying what he was thinking without saying it out loud. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. The ballroom was exactly as it had always been. The gardenias, and the expensive florist, and the lighting on the east wall, and the board members near the window with their view of the 2 things worth watching. The room that 11 years of attending had made as familiar as her own apartment, and then more familiar than her apartment for a long time, and then something she had had to learn all over again from the outside. But this year, when she walked through the doors, the room's geometry was different. Here is what Lena Holloway walked into that second October gala, and what was different about it. A room does not change its opinion about a person loudly. It does not make an announcement or hold a vote. What it does is small and cumulative, and felt rather than seen. The way people angled slightly toward her when she spoke, rather than slightly away. The way her name preceded her across the room and arrived before she did. The way she was introduced to 3 people before she asked to be. She had always been exactly this person. The room had simply caught up. They had been there perhaps an hour when she saw Garrett, north side of the room, near the bar, talking to a man from his new legal team. His posture had the particular effortfulness of someone working continuously to appear unaffected. She noticed, because she knew his face the way you know any landscape you have lived inside long enough, that he was thinner than he had been a year ago, not dramatically, just in the specific way people get when something has been spending itself against them over months without resolution. He saw her. He held her eyes for a long moment. Then he said something to the attorney beside him and crossed the room. She felt Roman register this without looking at him. She turned toward him slightly, just enough, and he understood from something in the angle of her shoulders to stay where he was. He stepped back one half step. No ceremony, no explanation, just made room. Garrett stopped 3 feet from her. The people in the immediate radius went quiet in the way of people who understand that something worth paying close attention to is about to happen. "Lena," he said. Most of his standard tone was there, not quite all of it. She looked at him, not with anger, not with the accumulated weight of everything the past 2 years had cost, with the clear, direct attention of someone who has nothing left to prove and therefore no need to perform anything at all. She had not prepared lines. She had never worked that way. What she had done over the course of the past year was think clearly about what was true and what she actually wanted him to understand, and what that would look like when she was finally standing in front of him to say it. 7 years you spent trying to make me smaller, she said. Level, no heat in it and no need for any. And then another year trying to make me disappear. Here is what all of that accomplished. The gallery is still open. The settlement was on my terms. She paused for exactly 1 beat. And the only thing you actually managed to remove from my life is you. All things considered, Garrett, I think I came out ahead. Here is what happened to Garrett Davenport's face when she finished speaking. The glass in his right hand went still first, not set down, just completely still, as if the instruction to move had not arrived. Then his jaw moved, once, in the specific way of a man who has prepared a word and discovered in the moment of delivery that the word is no longer available to him. His eyes, when they found hers, had lost the quality she had watched him maintain in every room he had ever walked into for 11 years. The quality of a man who believes the situation is still in the process of being decided and that he is the one deciding it. It was gone, simply gone. In its place was something she had never seen on his face in all those years. Not anger, not the rapid recalibration she had watched him perform 100 times. Something quieter and more final than either of those. The expression of a man who has just understood something large and simple that he should have understood years ago, understood it too late, and cannot unknow it. He looked at her, and he looked at the woman she was, which was the woman she had always been, and he had nothing. She watched him for 1 moment. She had earned the right to watch him for 1 moment. Then she turned and walked back to Roman. He was standing with a glass of water, and the deliberate stillness of a person who has been doing something specific with his hands to avoid doing something else. He looked at her when she reached him. "You step back," she said. "It was not mine," he said. She studied the side of his face. He was looking out at the room, giving her the angle to look at him without making it an occasion. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me for getting out of your way. I am thanking you anyway," she said. Something moved across his expression. He looked at her for a moment with the careful quality she had first noticed 12 months ago in an elevator on the way down from a party they had each come to alone. Then he said, "All right." They stayed another hour. She had the conversation with the Chicago curator she had been hoping for. 20 minutes about venues and timelines, and what the photographer wanted the work to mean in a larger space. Roman introduced her to a collector from Houston who had been asking about her specifically and who turned out, in 12 minutes of conversation, to be exactly the kind of person she actually wanted to work with. On the way out, she heard Garrett's name mentioned twice in conversations that had nothing to do with her. The tone was the same both times. the particular neutral register a world uses when it has filed someone under a different category than before. In the car going downtown, her phone rang. Becca, hey, her sister said, and the texture of it told Lena she had been crying and had mostly stopped. What is wrong? Lena said immediately. Are you okay? I am fine. I am good. A breath. Someone paid off my loans, all of them. Tonight. I got an email from the servicer and I called to confirm, and they said the VAT balance was cleared through an anonymous charitable education fund, and I do not know who did it, and I have been sitting here for an hour trying to make sure it is real. Lena did not answer immediately. She knew. She knew the way you know things when you have been paying close enough attention to someone long enough to recognize the exact shape of how they operate. Anonymous fund, no announcement, done quietly and in advance and without asking permission. It is real, she said. Lena, do you know something about this? I will find out, she said. But Becca, just let it be real tonight. A breath, then quietly. Okay, the votive candle, Lena said. A small wet real laugh. Someone added a second one, and a handwritten note that says, may it rest in flavor. Go to sleep, Lena said. Call me tomorrow. She put the phone in her pocket. Roman was looking at the window on his side of the car. He had the quality of a person who had not been listening, and also the quality of a person who understood exactly what he had just heard. The loans, she said. He turned. Becca's loans. When? 2 days before Garrett's office made the inquiry about her servicer, he said. She held this. The timing of it. 2 days before the pressure point could be armed. You did not tell me, she said. No, why? He looked at her directly, not away, not at the window, not at the city going past, at her, because I knew you would say no, and I needed it done before he could move on it. And I understand that those are not sufficient justifications for making a decision that belonged to you. He held her gaze steadily. Both things are true at the same time. She looked at him. She thought about the envelope he had slid through her gallery door. These are yours. Always were. She thought about him stepping back across the room tonight without being asked, making room for her without being told. She thought about Becca on the phone, crying with relief. Because 6 years of weight had been lifted before she ever knew it was in danger, and then she laughed, not loudly, not with anything performed in it. The real involuntary version that arrives when something is genuinely complicated, and also, underneath the complication, undeniable. He had done exactly the thing she had told him not to do, which was make decisions on her behalf without asking. And her sister had gone to sleep tonight without the debt she had been carrying alone for 3 years. Both of those things were completely and simultaneously true, and she did not have a clean position on either of them. And this was actually funny in a way she had no better word for. You are impossible, she said. I have been told this, he said. You cannot just move people without asking. I know, he said. And then, a beat later, I am working on it. She looked at him. He was not performing contrition. He was not managing her response. He was just there in the back of the car, in the dark, saying he was working on it in the tone of someone who meant it as a specific and ongoing project, not as something you said to close a conversation. She looked out the window, the city going past in its October way, the lights in the buildings, the people moving in directions she would never know anything about. When the car stopped in front of her building, she said, "Good night." "Good night," he said. "The coffee. I will be at your door before you open tomorrow." She looked at him. "You do not need to do that." "I know," he said. "I will be there anyway." She went inside. 3 days later, she was in the gallery, after hours doing the end-of-week accounting at the back desk. The show was in its 4th week. 2 more pieces had sold that afternoon. She was working through the commission figures in the quiet of a closed gallery when she heard the knock at 7:15. Roman was outside the front glass door, not knocking again, standing, looking down the block, giving her the option to simply not respond if she needed that to be an option. She went to the door and unlocked it. He was holding 2 coffees. She knew without being told which one was hers, because at some point in the past several weeks he had worked out how she took it, not by asking, by paying attention. "It is 7:15, she said. "I am aware of the time," he said. She stepped back and let him in. He came through the door and stopped in front of the east wall, the full series in the evening light, the plateau photographs, and the pieces arranged around them, a complete world contained in 8 images. "The Chicago Museum called Tuesday," she said. "The curator is recommending the full series for a traveling exhibition. 18 months on the timeline." He turned. "That is what you built this for?" "Yes," she said. "Not the exhibition specifically. The thing where the work goes somewhere it can be seen at the scale it deserves, by people who are ready for it." He looked at the wall, then at her. "I know," he said. "I have known that since the first time I walked through this door." She looked at him. She decided to say the thing she had been turning over for several weeks. "I have been thinking about the elevator," she said. "A year ago, you said, 'I know what you did for Katya,' and then you stopped. You did not frame it as something you were going to do for me in return. You said it and then you waited." She held his eyes. "That was the first time in a very long time that someone with the ability to arrange a situation gave me space to decide what to do with information before deciding it for me." The thing underneath his composed surface was more present than it had been across all the months since that night. Not dramatically, just there. "I was not in the room when Katya needed me," he said. The specific fact that had shaped 20 years of how he operated. "I have spent a long time getting into position before anything can go wrong. I know what that looks like from the other side of it. You told me in September. I have been thinking about it since." "I know you have," she said. "How?" he said. "Because you have done it differently," she said. "You asked before you issued the statement. You stepped back tonight. You left the envelope." She looked at him steadily. "I noticed things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where does this go?" Not anxious, genuinely asking. The question of a person who is used to knowing the outcome in advance and is, in this particular situation, willing to not know. She thought about it honestly. She had been thinking about it for weeks, in the spaces around everything else. "I do not know exactly," she said, "but I am not afraid of that." He was quiet for a moment. "Neither am I," he said. She held out her hand for the coffee. He gave it to her. Their hands were in the same space for a moment, close enough that the proximity was its own thing, and neither of them moved away from it quickly. "I need to finish the accounting," she said. "I know," he said. He sat in the chair near the window. She went back to the desk and opened the spreadsheet and worked through the figures. The gallery was quiet in the way it is quiet when someone is in it who belongs there, not as a guest and not as a visitor, but simply as a presence that the space has made room for. She was aware of him the entire time, not as something requiring management, just there. When she closed the laptop and put on her coat, she found him still at the window, looking at the plateau at dusk in the fading security light. The way you look at something that gives back something you needed. She turned off the interior lights. "The Chicago trip," she said. 4 days in February for the exhibition meetings. "I have an office there," he said. She looked at him. "I know you do," she said. "I am mentioning it." He looked back at her. "I am noting it," he said. She almost smiled. The almost was enough for tonight. She set this alarm and they came out together, and she locked the gallery door. They stood on the sidewalk on West 23rd in the October cold, the warmth finally gone from the air for the year. The city's sounds carrying differently now. The the street quiet in the way it gets quiet on weeknights when all the lives within 2 blocks have moved behind glass. There was nothing that needed to be said. She had come to understand that this was unusual for her, the absence of the need to fill a silence, and that it was one of the things she had noticed about being in his company. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went inside. The following morning she was at the gallery before she needed to be, because she wanted to be there when the October light came in at the particular angle it reached in early morning, the angle that showed her what the east wall looked like when the room was doing exactly what it was meant to do. She stood in that light and looked at the show she had built in the space she had fought for, on terms that were entirely her own, and she let herself feel it completely for one moment without qualification. Then she saw him outside the glass door, Roman on the sidewalk, 2 coffees in a carrier, looking down the block the way he always looked, with the patience of someone who does not find waiting difficult and does not need to announce his presence, not knocking a second time, not pulling out his phone to fill the space, just there, on the sidewalk, in the early October light, available to be let in if she chose to let him in. She stood in her gallery and looked at him through the glass, a man who had spent a year quietly taking apart her husband's financial world and had stepped back at the decisive moment so the ending could be hers, who had paid her sister's debt before it could be used as a weapon and had not mentioned it until he was asked, who had sat in a chair by the window last Thursday because she was working and had not made it into anything other than what it was, who was standing on her sidewalk at 7:56 in the morning with 2 coffees, not knocking a second time, because he understood the difference between showing up and assuming he was wanted. She walked to the door. She unlocked it. She opened it. He held out the coffee. She took it. "You said before I opened," she said. "I did," he said. "You are 4 minutes early," she said. "Is that going to be a problem?" he said. She looked at him in the doorway of her gallery in the morning light, with the city starting up its ordinary day behind him, entirely unaware of everything it had taken to bring 2 specific people to this particular door on this particular morning. She stepped back. "No," she said. "Come in." She stepped aside. He came through the door, and the October light came in with him, the same light that had been coming through that window every morning for years, ordinary and exact and entirely hers,